Okay, so we're on about this history thing. My wife told me that I seemed very excited when I talked about historicity. She didn't know what it was, but it looked like I'm excited about it. But I'm against it. Anyways, where were we up to? Okay, so what we wanted to mainly try to present was that there's as usual, a old view, ancient view, right? Which we usually read through the, not really ancient, but that's where the only place where I could think straight, which is the so-called medieval view. And then there's two other things which are important, right? Ancient view, I mean, like what, in a Jewish context, like you say what the Tanakh thought, what Chazal thought, which I can collapse into one thing for all practical purposes. And then I can only understand that, though, when I think of what we call Rishonim, what Rishonim thought. Because I understand, mostly when Rishonim speak, I understand what they're saying. When I read Chumash, I could read into it whatever the hell I want, and which is why most of the people trying to do like critical reading of Chumash are not very impressive. At least they might be impressive in, I have to qualify this, they might be impressive in the way that they could organize the text or explain like technical or material textual level stuff. Maybe better than previous people because of information, because of development of methods and things like that. But when they get into theology or when they get into understanding thoughts or theories, they tend to be very boring, or in other words, they tend to collapse into whatever people in their weekend thought. Right? Makes sense? So for example, if you read Wellhausen, who does this great work of figuring out that there's 4 parts of the Bible, if you believe that theory, but in any case, it's definitely, whether it's true or not, it's definitely a better theory to explain at the material level certain problems, which maybe nobody thought of before. Maybe there's certain methodology that he's working off that didn't exist before, which is like scientific history and so on. But when he gets to talk about like what the point of all of that is, he says very regressive things. In other words, that all the like so-called progress that you have with like figuring out texts and his material level of history, like what facts are, like the facts, really disappears when he gets into the theory level. Because his theory is just a Protestant German guy from the 19th century, and nothing more, nothing less. Like it ends up saying, like Wellhausen says, well, you know, Vayikra was these legalistic people, and the Catholics, and basically the Varim are the Protestants, and like it's very boring, because like you're just assuming that your own problems are in the ancient text, so that doesn't help. The Rishonim do this also. They also think of their problems as the ones that the text has, but since they're thinking of eternal things, that's their whole idea of wisdom, to think of eternal things, so they have less of this problem, right? Or in some sense less of this problem, right? Because if you say everything...
That's a more interesting version of a solution.
It's a more interesting way of thinking of the problem. Because if you say, well, everything is responding to their time, besides for me, who knows the truth, you know, then the kind of problems that you're going to have are going to be very timed problems. Like for example, like this like tension that Protestants like talking about in Hasidim, which is a version of Protestantism, between you know, the letter and the spirit. I mean, it's a Christian problem, very old thing. Is a very timed thing. In other words, there's not really a question here. Like everyone agrees that you should have both. It's just like in certain periods, certain people tend to go off, and like it becomes like a very like medical, right? Like in the ancient concept of medicine, like fixing things instead of understanding what the correct human is, which is what physics should be about, or biology. It becomes about medicine, right? Remember, in the old days, people thought that medicine was not a real science, or not as a worthy or honorable, right, valuable science as understanding as actual science, because medicine is all about fixing things, and medicine is all about like, oh, you're too cold, let's make you more hot. You're too hot, let's make you more cold. Like, that's the ancient way of thinking. But nowadays it's a little more fancy, but it ends up being the same kind of. You could turn that down if you wanted. It's hot. Nowadays it becomes more complicated with all kind of drugs and things like that, but still all about interventions which are to solve a specific deficiency or the opposite of deficiency, too much of something, right? Excess, yeah. Which is very fine, but we need that, it's very important. But it doesn't let you understand like what this thing is that we're operating on, or what is a healthy human being. Like medicine doesn't really have an opinion about what health is, or can't have. And the same way, like if you talk about problems, like okay, so we have to be less legalistic and more like Siddish. Yeah, but we're defining medicine as the practical medicine, right? Not medicine as in the sense of understanding.
Even the goal of what to restore to the patient.
Yeah, but that's what's be precise. But that's something before the science of medicine. In this definition, it's just definitional. Like we call this in nowadays it's called clinical medicine as opposed to like
Research medicine.
yeah, something like that. Clinical in the sense of what medicine, like literally what medicine do you give to what person in what state, right?
Right, but there is a difference in terms of what your intended outcome is, right?
Yeah, of course.
So in a doctor trying to let you relieve pain versus
Yeah.
long life.
Yeah, but that would sort of be out of the bounds of what I'm talking about, right? Because I'm speaking of I'm just trying to define like the difference between timed problems and untimed problems, and why certain problems or certain kinds of thinking make you stuck in a certain place. I got into this in some of a sidetrack, but I'm just saying, if you, for example, this thing that we talk about, like, okay, we're too Litvish, now it should be a little more Hasidish. That's not a real thing. That's just medicine. Because ideally, obviously, and there isn't like even a definition. That's what people are looking for, definitions of these things. They don't have definitions because they're just like, let's say there's such a thing. Even if we believe this dichotomy of like the law, the letter, and the spirit, there needs to be a letter and there needs to be a spirit. And actually, the point of the letter was always to get to the spirit, and the spirit was what gave birth to the law. It's not really like the whole contradiction only exists in like certain broken people's minds or certain broken people's lives, right? If you're
just saying it's just like doses. That's what you just when you say you need more spirit, you're just a matter of doses.
Yeah, always.
You're not adding anything.
I think so. I don't think there's any machlokes relative to the principle. Everyone agrees. That's why people that try to make things like Judaism is more about this and Christianity is more about that and Islam is more about that. I think those are stupid. Like as far as definitions goes, those are dumb, because everyone agrees you should have both, and ideally I can very easily give you a definition where this contradiction doesn't exist. Of course, in reality, I could give you, like my Muslim, the guy, like which is the correct direction, left or right? Well, it depends. If you're here, if you're more to the left, you should go to the right. If you're more to the right, you should go to the left. Well, ideally, you should be going straight or whatever towards whatever goal is. Yeah. Anyways, that's like a way. But Mashankan, if you read Rishonim, you'll notice them not having these kind of issues, at least when they're trying to do thought. Because their conception of thought is always the eternal things. They might be wrong, they might be somewhat prioritizing their own specific problems over like the eternal things. Because making a mistake, and because everyone lives in a certain time and therefore is going to see things through his own subjectivity. But at least their goal is not that. Their goal is always the eternal things, and therefore reading their Pirishim is getting closer to what the original meaning is. That's my basic thing. But that's just why when I say the ancient way, I'm also going to connect it to the medieval way, that's what we call Rishonim. And not saying, and the funny thing is like when people don't do that, they end up having like both the Chumash and them talking about the same timed problems, or different ones, but in different times, but the same kind of problem, right? The same level of questions, and that's not interesting according to me. Okay, but the important thing is that there's these two things, but then there's a third thing, and this is important, very important to distinguish. So the ancients, meaning the ancient thinkers, ancient philosophers, they all have this concept of knowledge being something stable, or we could talk about even something like human nature being something stable, as stable as it can be, and therefore like Musar, right? Musar doesn't pretend to be a periodic thing, right? Even Musar. Is Musar a response to problems of the times? Does Musar have historical consciousness? Not really.
I mean,
you could say that.
Maybe they say it's triggered by specific.
That's if you're a staricist, you're always going to say it's triggered by certain things.
That's not even smart to say, because like whatever, yeah, fine. So
internally they don't think of it.
That's also eternal, right? That people
no, you could say this is a response to modernity, like everyone is saying, but
at least say specific like ethical stories.
Because Rav Salante saw the guy, and these kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's also
no, but that in itself is eternal, right? That there's a guy who does bad in
right. So Musar for sure internally, right? There's always this distinction, but for it thinking of itself, doesn't think of itself as a response to problems of the times. It sees itself as a response to the problem of being human, which is sort of the same problem. You could say, am I doing the same exact way as Avram Avinu did? Maybe yes, maybe not, but I'm working on the same problem as he worked, right? So that's one, the old way, like the ancient way, okay? And that leads to being quite disinterested, or at least devaluing history, right? In the sense of the changes of human nature.
I think Musar did it by a little bit. They didn't make it eternal enough. Like they
okay.
Because the Torah, it says the most important thing is do Musar, but while they really should have said is like made it more of a
I don't even mean specifically the Salant or Musar movement, but in general, the concept of Musar is an eternal concept. Although it's not talking about the eternal truths, it's talking about like constant human issues.
But I just mean to say is even that you can see people take that kind of thing and kind of and try to not make it eternal almost, like as much as possible. Say, oh, really? Let the Torah really like this is the most important thing. That mitzvah is the most important thing.
Okay, and
Lafuke like keeping it as a very human issue, because then you just stay more focused. Because otherwise, someone will come and say like, that mitzvah is more important than this mitzvah. Right? You just make it some sort of
like. No, it was always the most important mitzvah to have good mitzvahs.
I think they made a mistake. I think it's
because Musar is of course, but that's different. Let's leave that on the side. Okay, that's why I said it's not about eternal truth. It's about eternal or at least constant. I don't know if we could call it eternal, but constant or perpetual human problems, like Gava. Like Aval Musar gives a shmisa about Gaiva. Gaiva has been the issue of Adam and of Choyrach and of everyone else. And we have the same issue. Well, do we have it the same exact way? Probably not, but we have the same issue. And it's what the Torah says somewhere and so on. Right? Okay? This is the ancient way. So the ancient way is always going to be divided into like theoretical knowledge, which is philosophy, and practical knowledge, of which a part is at least Musar. And the Musar movement is somehow devaluing theoretical knowledge for whichever reason, but that's another problem or another mistake that they have or another emphasis that's wrong. But the point is, it's still not something that exists in time, or not at least as much. Okay, now what is this? There's another thing. This is all the ancient, or at least we call it the Rishonim thing. Okay, the medieval thing, because when you say ancient, it gets problem. But now there's another thing, and the other thing is. And we have to distinguish between these two things because these two things get very much. This is a very important story, part of the story that we're trying to tell, which is that those two things got confused in many people's minds, and maybe it's even the actual question: how do we define the distinction? But very clear to me that there's this distinction. There's something else called Cartesian rationalism. Okay, just a name. It's not Descartes' fault, or maybe it is, but not the point. Okay, and which is very different from that. Okay, on the one hand. The medieval thought, the like classical, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, thought, is one that believes that knowledge is going to be about stable things, about eternal things, and therefore there's a certain kind of demand for certainty, the things that we could know very purely, like almost analytical truths, although they don't see it that way, things that we can know very surely, very directly, notions like that, okay? Now, Descartes and the whole tradition around that, the early modern philosophy, takes this idea of which comes from Aristotle, that comes from the way that Aristotle was explained and so on, and takes this idea and switches it into something very slightly different, which makes it very different. Because instead of the focus on the things or the kind of objects which are worthy, right? The knowable things, which because of them being knowable things, because of them being kind of things that can be known, therefore must be eternal and so on, and unchanging, they change this into a kind of demand for extreme rigor or extreme certainty, but certainty missing the truthness part of it, in some sense. There's something missing. I don't have the correct definition. But another way of saying this would be something like...
There is a switch from the integrity of the knowledge to the integrity of the knower.
Yes, also. But both of them, you have to remember that the ancients also thought that you're going to have certainty. But in some sense, the certainty to them is secondary to the absoluteness of the knowledge. And for Descartes, the whole search is about search for certainty. So there's a different kind of, when Descartes sits down in his meditations and he says, I'm going to find out what I could know for sure. Right? Whereas if you're the Rambam, you're going to say something like, I want to know what can be known for real, or what can be really known. And these things are slightly different, or they might have a very similar motivation. Now there are like medieval texts that literally say Descartes' kind of words and thoughts. So it's a little hard to show how simply this is different, because it comes out of a same kind of drive, like the drive to get out of the cave. I don't want to live in this like mitzvah, we're just assuming things to be the way they seem to. I want to stop having, right? So this is, for example, this is a thing that Descartes wouldn't say. Or at least the kind of traditionally work. Like things seem to be a certain way, but they're not really, and I want to know how they are actually, how they are really, not how they seem. That's why I use this word really. And the Cartesian way is something like, I think certain things mistakenly, and I want to know for sure what I think, or can I know them for sure?
I think, but Kant is the end of that thought
A lot of
process.
things are the end of many things.
There is no real thing, right?
Maybe. Well, not exactly. It's
But if there is a real thing, I can't know.
it's the resurrection of what the real thing is, but that's different. Yeah, Kant is trying to solve this problem.
But coming the other way, coming from the Cartesian,
Yeah,
starting from the knower.
yeah, all kinds of thoughts like this. But this is very different. We have to note that it's very different. It's a very different drive, and you have both of them, and you can have language in Rambam and all kinds of medieval authorities that say things like this, like why do you just trust what someone else told you, and how could we know what we know, and all kind of questions like this. And they're very similar. I can't say that they're. I'm not sure how sharp the distinction is, but there is a distinction.
It seems like directional. Is like a direction that's happening. Like they're starting, like Descartes starting from the person. Like you say about starts from the person, and they're starting from like.
But everyone has to start from a person. I think the reason he starts from the person is it's the opposite. The reason he starts from the person is because it seems to be more certain to him. So the more correct thing would probably be to say that the question, if both of them talk about both certainty and absoluteness or truthness of the things, but the Achronim are going to make certainty almost the main thing. Sort of their whole scale, everything turns into degrees of certainty.
Right, but that certainty also is focusing on the ability for us.
Certainty is about me. So that's what certainty means. Right, I know for sure.
It's about us to know certainly enough for the knowledge to be able to contain the quality of certainty.
Not exactly correct. Descartes does think that, but it starts from certainty. It starts from what can I know for sure. So degrees of knowledge are always collapsed to degrees of certainty. Degrees of how sure are you about this? Could you swear about it? Is it only a chazaka? Things like that. And the earlier people are not, the difference is something like this. I'll tell you the difference. The difference is something like this, that there are certain things that we know for certain, but they're not knowledge in the ancient sense at all. That's one direction, right? Certain inferential things, which maybe they're inferred not by like a strict syllogism, like something very, very clear, but we can know them for certain. In other words, even sense data, which again is a big machlokas, even ancient machlokas of how to read it. But some people would say this is not certain, although it's known for sure. It's not true knowledge, although it's not doubt. Like even just having a dream, right? You actually having a dream. You're missing certainty about like representational content of that dream, but you'd have a dream. And for the old way of thinking, there is something missing, even though it's certain. And the same way, vice versa. In some sense,
is knowledge.
Yeah.
Because you can't really.
This like quality of knowability.
Right.
Yeah. Like if you would have something that happens, for example, if you think about nature, if you would have something that happens every single time, but it happens by some God sneezing every single time in the same way. It's very predictable, for example. You could know it sort of certainly, but you wouldn't have knowledge of it. Descartes might get stuck on things like this. The famous example of okay, you know the Gettier problem. Okay, that's a challenge for Cartesian knowledge. It's not a challenge for the ancient kind of knowledge.
You want to go into it, or you
No, not for now. No, I'm gonna get confused. I want to say something else.
Okay.
The point is that these are two different kinds of questions. In other words, the question is what is the main drive? What is the main question that you have being a philosopher or being a thinker or being a whatever this thing that we're talking about is, right? Is the main thing I'm not a guy that believes whatever I'm told? Is that the biggest drive? I'm not a gullible person. Like, is philosophy about being less gullible, right? Less trusting. Same thing. By the way, gullible is just a word for when we don't like someone that's trusting, we call it gullible. It just has different connotations, but it means the same thing, right? Is that what it's about? Or is it about having more direct access to the real? Or being more so I don't want to be gullible, or I don't want to be in the dark, right? Like Plato says, I don't want to see shadows only. I want to see the things in themselves, the real ones. I want to know which things are real.
Like Descartes would say that you want to know.
Descartes would say, which is very, very reasonably, that don't talk to me about anything real before you know how you know any of this.
The greater interest for him would be is to prove what the shadow is. Let's say,
right.
Not just.
Well, he has a point, because I'm just going to talk about things, and how do you know that it's true? You always have to know how you know, and therefore his main bidder is going to be, how do I know what I know, and how well could I know it? How certain can I be in my knowledge? But that's very different. So in other words, it's in some sense set up for like a debate club. It's set up for being able to win arguments. It's set up for being able to answer how you know what you know. So, for example, knowledge, non-discursive knowledge, right? Knowledge that is not, in any sense, like what we call nowadays mystical knowledge, intuition, revelation, things like that, don't at all, like for the modern view, are something different. It's not knowledge, something qualitatively different. Like it's a different thing. Like maybe like they can't deny it, because that's how the system is set up. You can't say what never happened. Can't deny it. Like people claiming mystical experience, or people claiming I just know things. In the new model, in the modern system, you can't say I know that that's not true. I don't know, but like that miracle didn't happen to me, so it's a miracle. It's outside of the system. It can't give me what I'm looking for. Or if it does give it to me what I'm looking for, it's going to be in a way of like ripping up all my previous books, right? If you're like a skeptic, right? If you start from skepticism, if you're like a skeptical searcher, and then one day you fall asleep and you have some kind of dream, just some vision that forces you to now believe in all kinds of things, you would go and rip up all the previous books that you wrote, because either those are just the wrong system, or they just don't have any way of talking to each other. That's why there's a lot of thousands of versions of this, but that's why, because of the search being for an anti-skepticism, like for something that can be known for sure, like things that can't be known at all in this way, like can't be used to answer a skeptic, are useless. They might destroy the system, but they're useless for the system. Which is why you have in modern times this whole concept of like the dichotomy between mysticism and philosophy, which doesn't actually exist for any ancient philosopher. I mean, of course, this is a huge oversimplification. It does, but to a very deep extent, it doesn't exist in the same way.
Definitely was the enemy or the antithesis of it.
Yeah, it's not like, rationalism versus mysticism. No, those two things. Well, he doesn't understand either of them. But both of these things are supposed. If your lead is against some kind of, like, I'm not your whole drive is, I'm not one of these guys who believes every theory he sees, then it's a dichotomy. If your search is to know the truth, it's sort of the same thing as, I can say that in a New Age way, to experience the real. What's the difference between knowing the truth and experiencing the real? Those are the same thing. Or to directly access the universe. I don't know. All of these things are the same thing. Well, if there's another way, if there's like a way of fasting, it might be a very legitimate thing philosophically.
It might be that it's more likely that it will fall out more on the rational things that come out of the rational sense, but that's just that's not the point of it.
I don't even think that's true. In other words, this is all like sort of random or accidental groupings. Just like every Republican also believes a whole bunch of things, and every Democrat also believes a whole bunch of things.
We're also not in the business of trying to disqualify bad theories because it brings us closer to the truth directly, but just because it's not the right one, not because it is the wrong one. Right?
Meaning
you have a mystical theory and it's not, let's say, there's nothing about that we would disqualify on the basis of,
Well, there's various problems with mystical kind theories. Like, for example, on the other hand, I could go backwards. Does it accomplish what we're looking for?
So right, but that's the operative question, not that whether or not it followed an anti-skeptical process.
Well, if you're so what I said was only halfway true, because I said that it can't talk. Like there's a difference where if you're for the most part, and this is only halfway true again, like you could read people doing this, but for the most part, if you're an old-fashioned philosopher who has a vision, you don't stop being a philosopher. You're going to integrate that into your philosophy, or you're going to show where it belongs and things like that. You're not going to convert into some different religion of visions.
If you would see a nace, you would say, I can't. It's not.
No. A miracle is a little complicated, but
let's say
an epistemic miracle.
But the point is that if it's something that's temporary, that's truly temporary.
That's the opposite side. That's the other side of it. Well, one second. I really should have. Maybe that side is more correct. I was saying, on the one hand, you can't solve, like the way it's solved. In other words, the way you're going to solve the problem of skepticism by becoming a mystic is by ignoring it. That's why all the modern mystics are totally crazy.
Ignoring what?
And the ancient mystics are less crazy.
So what did you say?
Because, so I'm going to get to your side in a second. It's the other side of it. What you were saying also. I was saying first, and maybe I'm totally wrong what I was saying. I was saying that if your problem is not being gullible, you're always like, everyone you like psychoanalysis. Everyone is running away. You trusted someone once and he betrayed you, so now you became a philosopher. That's one way into philosophy. Being betrayed. Like, I believed this book and then I found that it was false. Many such cases. So really this is like a kind of therapy. Like what can I trust now? Oh, you can trust math. Okay, become a mathematician. Well, math doesn't help me at all. Oh, problem. Or it doesn't help me solve life problems. No, this is a story that you could read literally, people writing autobiographies saying this. Great people. Now that kind of problem, well, it could be solved by some kind of outer body experience or whatever. But it's going to say something like, well, my whole progress was for naught. Because I thought you can't trust anything. It turns out you could. It turns out I should have trusted, I should be trusting, should be gullible, should be open. Right? In other words, that's the same thing, what sounds good or bad depending on which mood you're in. I should have been open, right? Because I was running away from the Rebbe being able to make kishuf, and then the Rebbe made a good kishuf. So it turns out I was wrong, right? So I made no progress in all of my meditations, finding out what I can actually believe, because those progresses were useful. They were just me stopping to be gullible, but I am gullible.
the reason why I thought being gullible was wrong. So let's go back to it.
Well, I thought it was wrong because it betrayed me, because it turned out that I jumped on that person's direction and I did fall. Well, now I do fall, so maybe we have to figure out which times it falls and which time it doesn't. I'm not sure. I think something like this. So that's why keep on thinking about this like non-integration that happens, like this Hasidic Yidden being against thinking, because they're all about trying to access reality in some kind of ecstasy, and doesn't seem like thinking helps for that at all, according to them. They don't see the connection at all, because the thinking, it's true. It's a different. I can like think about it emotionally. I don't know why I'm getting into this. You can think about it emotionally as being a different disposition. Like thinking is being closed. See this word open and closed? Being a thinker means being cynical. Go around. People think that, right? It means being closed. It means I do not. There's like a wall between me and the world. To me, I'm accepting propositions as
it's like
true.
A negative theology. It's more of like a negative proposition than anything. Is that what you're trying to say?
It's very positive. It's a
See, but that's
standoff.
When you say it's a cynical thing, that's what it means. It ends up being more of like a negative idea than anything positive to say. And
So it depends
assuming
who
you would
stands.
say that it's a positive.
Yes, it doesn't have. It's negative. Of course, it's negative in the sense of it's better. You could say something like this. You remember William James' Will to Believe? I'm thinking a lot of that. It's better at telling you what not to believe than telling you what yes to believe. Yes. That's why Descartes ends up with this like one little thing from which he's going to try to rebuild the rest of the world. But it's much better at destroying than at creating. Yes. But I can't say that it's entirely negative, because there is like some mitzvahs I say, which says something, thou shalt only believe things that have good proof, or things you saw for yourself, whatever. Figure out what it's something like that. It's not entirely negative, but it's the motivation.
Premise is that you need to
The motivation, well, we all start negatively.
The motivation is more to shun lies and to find truth.
Yeah, and William James has the thing, like, are you more afraid of believing the falsehood, or are you more afraid of not believing the truth? And you're going to have to choose between the two, because you don't have the choice of doing both. That's what he claims. Yeah, but I don't think the other shit that also starts from something negative, because you have to remember, nobody comes to philosophy when they're a baby. Like, you're always going to have wrong conceptions. Everything starts with noticing that some of your conceptions are either wrong, but the question is in what way they're wrong. So what philosophy starts off being dialectic, or maybe ends being dialectic. It's always going to be, let's fix our mistakes. It's never going to be start from zero. There's no zero. People that don't make mistakes don't do anything.
The best way to be if you view it as inadequate.
Oh, yes. So there's a difference. So yes, it's true that there's some less, the old way that I'm describing, I should stop calling them old, because old is a historical language. The good way is less mad, right? It's got less psychological baggage. Another one of those metaphors that.
I think it comes off as cynicism is because it excludes things that it doesn't think are true. So people are like, oh, so you don't believe it, right? Anyone who can't hear what you think is true thinks you're only excluding him.
I understand.
That's how it plays out.
I understand.
And that's what people use. Like, if you think that's what people think. A thinker is a cynic. That's why they automatically assume that.
Well, because many thinkers are cynics.
That's also true.
The 99% put out a bad name for the 1%.
That's also true. But in general, even the 1% tend to, at least the thing that people get from them is just the exclusions, not the actual thing itself.
Right.
And
the ones, no, interestingly, the ones that do something don't really care if you have the whole negative apparatus, right? Because if I have this is why people nowadays get so upset at the concept of noble lies. Noble truth, noble mishalim, right? Lies is a bad language, although Plato didn't have a problem using it. But meaning to say, if you have a truth that you want to teach people, and it's a true truth, well, you're going to find any way to teach it, because it wants to be taught. Truth wants to be taught. That's one of the, information wants to be free, and truth wants to be taught. And you're not going to care if people get to it in the wrong way, although that's a problem. It is a problem, but at least it's going to help. You can do as much as you could. Mashenka, if you're all about like only believing what you've seen, then that is useless, right? lying to people in order to get them to the truth won't do anything for that kind of thing. Yes, that's another difference. But it's also less mad, because it's less mad at what you're taught. So you have to, in order to become a philosopher, you have to be mad at your Rebbe. You have to realize that he was wrong. That's where everything starts. Like Avram Avinu, my father is wrong. That's where everything starts. But the question is what kind of wrong he is, okay? You could say he was wrong because he was teaching me things. And philosophy is not allowing yourself to be taught. Which is a very weird thing to say. Because then you're not going to learn anything. I mean, even Descartes really is stuck in some way in his room, and he's not sure if he should believe in anything else existing or only himself existing and everything else. But like, how are you going to ever learn anything? Even empiricism, you need to trust the outside world for it to work.
The Medrash has Avram saying it's inadequate. Again, like that word.
Right. So there's so that's one way. So there's a less destructive, right? There's a non-destructive way of being Avram Avinu, which is the way of Socrates, right? The way of argument. By the way, argument is the nicest thing you can do to a person, although most people don't realize that, right? Because most people, when you argue with them, they think that you're destroying them, or you're only trying to make them better. But it's very hard for people to notice that, because I don't know why. The other way is argument. And argument is that it's not right enough, right? So we can have like this concept of you being appearance, right? The question is what's appearance? Is appearance bad? Is it something we're going to destroy now? Or is it something we're going to clarify, right? And if you say, for example, philosophy, you could have a whole bunch of like these negative and positive things. Like philosophy is not living what you were told, but thinking for yourself. One definition, the Enlightenment definition. You could have a like Platonic definition, which is mamish something like philosophy is not accepting appearances as reality. You could have other definitions. Sort of each philosophy is going to have its own definition of what it is. But like, for example, the appearance and beyond appearance, whatever the thing is not appearance is going to be slightly less fighting, right? It's going to make people slightly less mad, because it's going to say, yes, it seems to be this way. It seems to be this way to me too, right? I'm not better than you. It seems to be this way too. Just besides for it seeming to be a certain way, it also is another way.
Well, I think that's the key. The key is not that you're admitting that it also seems this way to me. That's helpful. The main thing is that you're saying that this is what it is. You're saying something positive.
Right.
You're saying.
Well, but that's a problem, because jumping to the positive, I think we can do the negative. There's a negative here. You're all living in a cave, right?
It's coming more. That's like an exclusion. But like you say is not true, but this is true.
What if I say that we're all living in a cave and I have no idea what's behind the cave? I never went out. I just know that this is a shadow.
I mean, you're just reframing it, but really what you're saying is that there's a truth out the cave,
I know,
right?
it doesn't help.
You're just saying
Isn't the
not
way.
able to access it. I mean, that's what you're saying, right? If you say just it's not a cave, just life is just like living in a cave and there's nothing beyond that, yeah, then that's pure negative. But you're not saying that. You're saying I'm not out of the cave.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even need to be Platonists for this, right? We could be modern scientists and say something like, there isn't a table, there's only atoms. Or you could say a table is made out of atoms. Those are the same thing, just one is nicer and one is less nice. One is like more antagonistic to people for no reason. Yeah. You're all dummies, you live in the world with tables. The reality you live in with a world of quantum fluctuations or whatever. And you're just being needlessly antagonistic, right? Let's bust some myths. Well, they're not a myth, it's the appearance, and the appearance, well, then you can get into the philosophical discussions to what extent the appearance exists, but there is like a foundational myth of myth busting in everything modern, which, it's for good reasons, and it doesn't actually help you understand anything. Okay, what am I getting at all of this? So you all know this anyways already. It's an important chazar. And what I'm getting at is that the nafkamina is like this. Nafkamina from this whole thing. So remember, if one definition is don't believe anything you are told, and the other one is don't think that what you see is all the truth. Right? Those are two very different motivations. right? We always say, like even nowadays I say often the difference in Kabbalah and Maimonidean philosophy is something like, the Maimonidean says, well, the Torah is nonsense, there's an eternal truth. And then Kabbalah says the Torah also has an eternal truth. It's the same exact thing, it just depends on the tone, almost. Anyways, so the point is like this, the point is that these two conceptions make for a very different understanding of when we talk about history. Why? In other words, let's say someone comes around and says, you people are not taking seriously enough the value of history as history. So the question is, against which of these two things is he going, right? Against which of these two anti-historical, right, ahistorical conceptions of truth is he struggling? Now, in reality, all of the historicism that we're talking about, start whatever the names were, like the Italian people and German people and so on, and English people and Scottish people, all of them are struggling against Descartes, not against Plato. And this is an important point, because all of them are saying, you think, now Descartes ends up in some sense even more austere than Plato, right? Because the things that you could know according to Descartes are less than the things that you could know according to Plato. And you know all kinds of things, all kinds of formulations that people have for this, because of, in some sense, his demand for knowledge, which comes out of the demand of knowing for sure, of certainty, leads him to a much more sort of dry or sort of, what do you call it, austere concept of science, of true science, than Plato ever had. So it's very different. It's not the same thing. And we can see this very obviously, because the Platonists never said the kinds of things against history that Descartes said, although they could say similar things. So, Descartes, I forgot to print you, in the beginning of the discourse on the method, he has like a list of reasons why history is a waste of time. Most of them boiling down to we can't know it.
It's like speculation.
And there's other things, and there's all kind of exaggerations and this and that, and therefore it's useless. There's other things, and this book analyzes the passage and gives like 4 things that's really saying, and then it goes on to deny all those 4 things and saying he's mistaken in this, mistaken in that, mistaken in that. But the important thing is that this book is mostly against Descartes and not against Plato. And that's because, you have to remember, not because according to Descartes there is more ways of fighting it, not because the Cartesian view of science can give you it could, not because that could make you more what am I trying to say, not because like what he says, but like the argument, and this book is advancing that argument, right? It's a pro-history book, you understand, right? Just in order to get to that, he tries to explain what he's against, which is what's very useful. Because we all live in this history and we don't realize what history is against. Because what he says is something like this: you have decided what science is. You, Mr. Descartes, and all his Chassidim, each one in his way, decided what true knowledge, what science is. And now this is a very restricted definition. How about other things that are also science? And either I could show you how history is a science, which is really what it's trying to do, or what kind of science it is. And you, Mitzimtzim, because of your like very small conceptions of what can be known, you're stuck with this, taking history out of your curriculum, out of science, and that's just wrong. Both because your concept of science is too small, and because your concept of history is too small, right? You can attack it from both sides. You could say, well, science must include more things than Descartes, for basically like critical reasons, right? Like David Hume says, well, what you think is science isn't really science, it's really just a kind of history, so might as well. Because when you say I know something, well, you're just telling me something about you more than you're telling me about the thing. That's how we started off, so that's history. So why are you against history if all your knowledge is some kind of history? Or you could do the other side. We could attack it from the side of history and say, you say that history is only about specific people in specific times, but that's not true. History is about patterns. History is about the preconceptions of history, and so on. And you say we can't know history? Well, we could. We could know, well, maybe we can't know what happened in the past, but who said history is about what happened in the past? Maybe the knowledge of history is about what the documents or the evidence of the past can show us. And we can know that pretty certainly because the evidence is here in the present.
Basically, it becomes a debate club. You said it's good for debating. It becomes a debate club. That's what it is.
Well, what do you mean? It becomes... History can also be in the debate club? That's the thing.
This whole argument, all these arguments you're saying against Descartes end up being he's saying that you can't know it. It's like, yeah, you could.
Yeah, but because of what he thinks knowledge is, both his criteria for your knowledge is too small, and secondly, his criteria of history is too small. And these are good arguments against that. They might be winning the history people. Not entirely, they're not really winning, but they could win that argument. It's a debate club in the sense of, well, it can. If that's what knowledge is, for example, if knowledge, like example, if you do the most, like this is not really Descartes, this is like real simplification. But if knowledge means don't accept anything on faith, right? If the principle, this is where we get these modern like Hasidic books having like philosophy and faith being two opposites, and then we get people saying that like Christian slogans, like God let me understand because I believe, these kind of prayers. The Christian scholastics have people say this is nonsense because either you believe or you have faith or you understand. But in the old way, that doesn't follow at all. I could know on something and the same thing I could understand, and I could also believe it. Not a problem at all. But if you take this like simple understanding of don't believe anything that you were told, well, obviously I could believe history without being told. In what way? Okay, then we have work to explain in what way that can be true. Right? Ancient history is all based on eyewitness. Even the Greek scientific history, so-called, sometimes is based on some guy told me, and he seems to be a trustworthy guy. But nowadays we say, well, we're not gonna care about what that guy said. We're gonna care what his saying says. Right? We're gonna take him as a piece of evidence, not as a witness. Different way of thinking. And then we have material evidence. We could go to the place of the battle and see some spears on the floor, and deduce from that there was a battle. All kinds of things like this. Now you could have skeptical history, right? You could have history without believing anyone. So Descartes' argument that history is all about believing people, which is what it was before him. You have to remember, almost all history before Cartesian history, sort of like the post-Cartesian history, is about believing people. And nobody thought there was something wrong with this. You have to remember. Well, that's what I have to get to the other side of this, right? There was nothing wrong with believing people because believing people is very fine and legitimate for the purposes of non-science, for the purposes of history, which might be useful, it might have many uses. Nobody says that it's totally useless. But if your whole thing is not believing people, now we have to figure out how history could be without believing people. And we could absolutely win that debate. Well, could you actually win it? In the sense of, well, you sort of did a bait and switch. Because everyone thought that history is about knowing what happened in the past. Now it's about knowing what the evidence of the past tells us. Well, why is that important? Okay, I can answer the question of why that's important also. It can be solved. Well, and I asked this question. What about the past which has no records? Just because there's no records, it's not important? It doesn't exist. Well, it doesn't exist. In modern history, it absolutely doesn't exist, right? We have this concept of prehistoric times, right? You know what prehistoric times means? It just means times about which nobody wrote anything down. How is that prehistory? If your concept of history is things written down, and not things that happened, then it makes total sense. And he might even explain that once you're writing down, then it creates a certain communal memory and blah, blah, blah. All these things are very real theories. I'm not here to make fun of them. I'm just here to show what leads to them. And what leads to them is this kind of the Cartesian concept of knowledge. Now, in the old-fashioned concept of knowledge, in the Plato's concept of knowledge, Plato says it explicitly, but everyone else almost assumes this in some sense. There is, I'm not saying that history has more place, I'm saying in some sense it has less place, but also it has more place. In other words, you're not going to have to solve this problem, and this problem is not a problem. Why? Because, Plato has arguments with poets,
so
right?
This history has to defend its relevance more than it has to defend its accuracy?
Yeah, exactly. Plato, for example, has all these arguments against the poets, right? And his arguments are almost never the stories you tell are false, right? Trojan War never happened. Well, firstly, he assumed that it happened. But why did he assume that it happened? You see, gets back to what I always getting back to. Why did he assume that it happened? Well, by the way, could it have happened? That's why. People used to be very whatever. Anyways, nowadays people assume that it happened, or at least in some sense. But why did he assume that it happened? Oh, because he knows that people are gullible. Even the greatest scientists were gullible. That's like one theory, which is the stupidest theory. Why would you be so gullible? I believe that. But the reason is, but there's a problem here. You have to understand. There's a problem. Like this Plato guy, Socrates, is going around applying these like really, really extreme criteria, really extreme methods of evidence to everything you tell him. Besides for when you tell him that there were 10 million people slaughtered by some king in some battle, he's like, yeah, sounds okay. What's going on? Ish probaya. Right? And the answer is that each thing deserves its kind of research. Even what's his name? You see, I think that he has a mistake, Collingwood, for example, who claims that Herodotus is going against Plato. Because Herodotus writes his histories, which are researches, right? History means research, inquiry. And his inquiry consists of asking people what happened. He doesn't do anything else. And sometimes the people tell them, and sometimes he doesn't believe them. The people tell him legends from 1,000 years ago, and he says, okay, this is what the guy told me. I'll report to you what he told me. And is Plato against that? Does Herodotus claim that this is knowledge? That this is philosophic knowledge? He claims that it's important to know. We could argue about that. In other words, we could argue if it's good models, like Plato would say. Is it educational? Does it teach you good values? Those are serious questions. But is it true in the sense that history can be true? Yeah, I don't think Plato would be even skeptical about it. Because his philosophy is not based on being skeptical about testimony. His philosophy is not a philosophy of mistrust. He didn't become a philosopher because his teacher lied to him. He became a philosopher because his teacher could not but lie to him. Big difference, because his teacher lived in the world of appearance, and the world of appearance is misleading. And that's fine. You've got to live in that world too. But now that you want to become a philosopher, you're going to have to dig deeper. You're going to have to dig up out of the cave. Not deeper, higher. Whatever. These are just metaphors. But he's not going to have any problem with believing that something happened because someone told him, because that's actually how history works. And just like, by the way, just like you could say, well, history is about the evidence of what happened, how about history is about the testimony of what happened? Makes just as much sense. Well, the only reason we think it makes more sense to rely on evidence than to rely on testimony is because we have this skeptical, we don't trust people. People are a bunch of liars, but paper doesn't lie. Paper lies too. Not even true. But at least it's still there. Okay, but it's not clear that that's actually so much better. I mean, we know there's all kinds of problems with eyewitnesses and so on, but maybe that's just how it is. So that's my main thing. So if you want to, he seems to all of these things is focusing against the Descartes. If you want to go against Plato, there's ways of doing it, but these are not the ways. You're gonna have to do other things. Maybe you're gonna have to do whatever the people that went against Plato to begin with did, and the question if they're right. But that's a very big question. You can't do it by saying, well, we have critical history. Critical history is an answer to Descartes, and a pretty good answer. Not a really good answer, but a pretty good answer. But critical history is not an answer to Plato at all. Because to be an answer to Plato, you have to, again, do one of the two things. Either deny his criteria for knowledge, in other words, deny that there's such a thing as knowing eternal truths, deny that there are eternal truths, all of these things of which Plato knew about, right? There's nothing new about these arguments. All of his arguments are against those kind of skepticisms. Nothing new about it. Or you can sort of broaden history to make it into eternal truths. At which point you're just doing Plato again, so it's no point. Because again, if history is about specific, and again, the people that say history is important, the only reason history could be important is because humanity, right? One of his criteria for history is, and that has the four of history. What is history studied for? It's studied for human self-knowledge. You've got to know what a human is and what kind of human is you are and what human you are. And since we assume, historicists assume that all people, at least to some extent, are their particular circumstances. So to know yourself, you got to know your history. The problem is that this reasoning is circular, because if you forget your history, then nothing will happen, then you'll just be a different kind of person. Like for the historians' theory of human self-knowledge to be true, you need to teach history in schools. Which is ksad baya. In other words, a historian comes and says, you Yitzchok, Lowy, your grandfather lived in Hungary, and there was this Holocaust thing, and before that was this and that, and that's what makes you what you are. Well, if I would have never heard of any of these things, it would not have made me what I am. Maybe unless in like most material sense, like why do I live in Howell? But not in any significant sense. It only makes you what you are when you have historical consciousness. In other words, when you're taught your history. Which is why we discussed this, right? Which is why all modern states and modern nations are based on teaching of history. Because that's what makes them what they are. But what if you just stop? Or what if you just teach lies that never happened? Well, that's what you are. Is there Palestinian, whatever, What does it make a difference about the actual history happened? You can teach whatever you want. So, there's like a circular reasoning and people being based on their history. They're only based to the extent that they want it to be. Well, what if we want to be based on myth? What's the problem with that? Because it's not true. Well, history isn't either true. I mean, it's true, but you told me that it's important because of what it does, not because of it being true, right? The truth of it isn't important. It's the knowing of it that's important.
And I would say you should make myths, make better myths at least.
Yeah. Why would it be stuck to be based on our history? Why don't we just make stories up? Or at least there's ways of doing this without lying, What about the future? What about Yom HaMashiach? Whatever is going to be then.
People try to do this.
Yeah. And all histories.
Movies about I think it's like a push to include certain minority characters to try to
yeah.
base yourself on those
I
things.
know. Hamilton was black, Yeah, maybe.
It's a good idea.
Well, yeah, everyone agrees with this, and it's true. History is the official theology of the West, and that's why it's always everyone is always doing drash on history, because it's important. Because it's not really about what happened. And besides, in the academies have their own myth. Like we're the people that care about what actually happened, but what do we actually care about? We don't deconstruct that. Chas v'shalom.
I was asking this question: why do people get so mad at myths, like historical myths?
What's wrong with believing lies about your past? Well,
they're good. I'm saying if they're good.
I think there's a philosophical virtue of not believing lies.
No,
in general. Why? Firstly because they're lies, and secondly because they don't teach you how to live in the real world. For example, if you're told like a history of our ancestors, they just lived on miracles, and whenever they woke up there was a man by their door, and that's how life works, then you might just try to live that way. It doesn't work, sadly. Until man comes again, doesn't really work. So that in that sense it could be destructive. Or like Plato says, you will learn bad midas and things like that. But maybe you could say, maybe someone would say, that's exactly what I want. I want you to live as if there's man. Then there's nothing I can answer, right? I just decided that it's wrong because it's wrong nowadays because it doesn't work. But if someone says, I don't really care about it working, I want you to live that way, then that's what you should do. I mean, there's...
I suppose it depends to what extent the lie is.
No, I wasn't saying that. You're changing reality with that. I'm just saying, within a store. So that's what I'm saying.
Oh, why it has to be true?
If your ancestors were bad people, so you'll be like, oh, I want to be like them. Say they're good people. You want to be good.
If you say that they're bad people, you might want to be like bad people. That's the problem.
Right. So therefore, we should lie and say they're good people. And be good like them.
You might want to be like them, and you won't be good.
Probably.
Well, I mean, it also depends, I think, to what extent the lie.
But that's baya. I mean, so what's the sheep? So again, we're going back to this.
I'm saying, but the point is, once the lies, obviously, you're just asking practically how do you create those? But once they seep in,
how do you make up lies? It's not hard to make up lies.
How do you get that? But the point of it would be is that fine. You could say that it might be destructive if you're the one making it up. But if they're already here, why are you so good at getting rid of it? Like who cares? People think that the grandparents did nice things.
It depends on
Okay, that's aside. I don't know how we got to this. I would try to do something else today. Why we wanted destroy the sacred cows? I don't know why. I think because there's a good way to do it. There are good reasons for that. Most people are doing it because they're betrayed by their teacher. But lies my teacher told me. There's a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, about history. That is a reason, and I can't devalue this. It's something important in the formation of many smart people. I think it causes a lot of destruction, but I can't deny it. I do think that it's a destructive drive, and I think that it's one of the things that causes all the intellectual problems. But it's a thing.
What, the myth busting?
Yeah, but like I say, it's a how's it called? There's a word for this. Psychologists have a word for this, like being burned by trust. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, there's the doxatic trauma. Okay, I don't know, something. I just made that one up. But there's like epistemic trauma that schools inflict on people. But it shouldn't be that way, because your correct attitude to not believing what your school said is that that probably was good, or that was just the appearance of things, or some kind of appearance, but not the reality.
There must be more to this, not there must be less of this.
Yeah. Which is how old-fashioned steiging works, right? You know, I learned in yeshiva Mishnayos, but now I know the Mishnayos is not as simple, right? There's Gemara, there's a Tosfos. That's very old-fashioned. There's nothing new about that. But anyways, yeah. So in the ancient way, both, if you say it in that way, there's nothing wrong, right? We don't have to. You don't have to try so hard. You don't have to try to make history into a fact, into like something that you can know for certain. No, we can know it for certain, and pretending that we do is useless, because all you're doing is redefining certainty. You know, it's like let's make everyone pass the test by making the test easier. That's not a very. I mean, it seems like a very common strategy, but it doesn't actually help anyone. I know the test is racist, but like it's an analogy here. But really, the test is at least signifies something in reality, and that's a thing. But that doesn't mean that the other things aren't a thing too. And now the other things have different questions. That's why maybe ethical questions are more important than veridical questions, right? The question of does learning these stories make you a good person, is at least as important as the question of did this actually happen? Especially if you assume that it's not about what actually happened. Even in the sense of trust, even in the sense of believing evidence, believing testimony, which is different than believing evidence. Testimony is not a kind of evidence; it's a relation between humans. That becomes a different question. We have this whole thing where maybe you should tell your children the story your parents told you out of loyalty to your parents, not out of believing their evidence. That's a whole other thing. But it has to do with this thing of like where you understand that there's nothing. The reason why this is not philosophy is because of the kind of thing it is. Not because there's not like one scale, right? That goes back to this thing. There's not one scale of like things we know more certainly and things we know less certainty. There's also different kinds of knowledge. Each of them can be known certainly and less certainty, and so on. But there's different kinds of knowledge, and the kind of knowledge that histories are about is not the kind that lends itself. It's true that it doesn't lend itself to the kind of certainty you could have about math, but that's fine. That was never supposed to. It doesn't take you out of the world. It doesn't give you Olam Haba. That's true. It's not. I forgot last week. I gave a class about this. I started also. The Rambam says that Moshe, the Yidden believed in Moshe only because you were listening to my class in Yiddish. Only because of Ma'amad Sinai, not because of the Nisim. Because it says a pasuk, "V'gam b'cho yamin la'olam." And the Rambam reads it like this. I don't think anyone noticed that this is what he's saying before me. Or at least I've noticed it last week. What does it mean, la'olam? The Rambam says la'olam doesn't mean forever. Doesn't mean in perpetuity in the rest of history. Although he says this pshat in a different place. But that's not how he reads it in Mishnah Torah. Right? It's not like a promise. They will always believe you. Well, what if tomorrow they don't? And actually they didn't. I mean, many people don't believe. What it means is that you will have a direct or certain understanding, which is the kind of understanding which you can't ask questions on. So he's saying there's like eternal knowledge, la'olam, which is the kind of knowledge that gets you into Olam Haba, because it's eternal. And the kind of knowledge that is not the kind which you could have, which there's another tzad, which has a question after. Not because nobody's going to ask the question, because it doesn't have a question, because there's only one truth. And therefore, what do I want to say about this? Right, therefore, what the Rambam says, and people get very confused about this, the Rambam says you should not believe miracles, right? If a prophet comes and makes miracles, you say, well, we have a Torah, it's better than that. And he says, Moshe, the Yidden didn't believe in Moshe because he did miracles, right? And people think, okay, so the Rambam is really saying, and he says like this, because if you believe in miracles, you always have doubt. Maybe it was Kishif. And this is a very weird doubt, because like for David Hume, like for most modern people, if you actually did miracles, that's where the debate stops, right? Like I said before, the system breaks. We could close our philosophy faculty and we could become religious Jews, right? But the Rambam says that's not my problem. He doesn't. Most people like now they seem to think that the Rambam probably says that because he doesn't really believe the miracles happened. Well, the problem he has with miracles is that miracles are not a science. Even if they do happen, they're not knowable. He might think that they can't actually happen, but that's very different from saying they didn't happen. He says they can't happen, which is a lot stronger than any modern scientist could say, because no modern scientist could tell you what can happen. He can only tell you what does happen, because science is not about what can at all. But that's also because of the same reason, right? Because science is about what must be and not what is. But what the Rambam says is that I would stand there and see the sea splitting and be very, very impressed, not denying reality, be very impressed, make a whole shira sayam, but that still wouldn't be philosophy.
Because it would give me knowledge of nothing.
Because it would give me temporal knowledge, it would give me knowledge that, he calls it lefiyat tzarech. It would save me from the Egyptians, which is very useful. Very, very useful. Great thing. You should praise God. You should be very happy. But it wouldn't give me knowledge. Or you could say it would give me knowledge of a specific thing that happened in a specific time, but not general knowledge, or the conditions for it being true knowledge. Or in other words, I'll say something like this, right? When he says the word la'olam, like when I die, will it make any difference to me for my eternal soul that I've been saved from the Egyptians? It will make no difference. But knowing that there is one God by proof, which is what happened to Mount Har Sinai, that will give me something forever. Not because I believe, not because it's more more veridical, right? Not because it's more certain, right? Because it's a different kind of thing.
That's also why he says you shouldn't believe in the Nevi'im.
Yeah, this is a whole chetl how it gets from there to here, but yeah. You should only believe philosophy. In other words, you should not believe. See, believe is the wrong word. This is by the way people make this mistake. The Rambam thinks you should believe Nevi'im. Just the correct amount. You should believe them in the correct amount. You should believe him if he's a Jewish Navi. You should listen to him. Well, you shouldn't believe him. By the way, he never says you should believe him. He says you should listen to him. Right. Which is very good.
Well, he should believe in Navi. That's what I'm trying to say. He actually holds you shouldn't believe in Navi. Doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to him.
Yeah, or you could say, it depends on, then we get into the definitions. You could call it whatever you want. You should be impressed. You should do what it says. You should even believe, but you shouldn't know. You shouldn't be confused between, and even if we talk about the most simple thing, right? What we talk about believing on testimony, right? I believe in this because a smart person told me. You see, according to our friend Peter Adamson wrote a book to justify belief in experts. Very, very funny. Should I say? This has nothing to do with this. You know so Enlightenment, liberalism has this basic contradiction, because the whole ethos is don't believe anyone. But that turns out not to be a way that you can live, especially not like the modern, I don't know how you call this, but the way that modern states are set up. Everyone has to believe in experts. Like what if you say the Sadah, especially if you're on the like center, I don't know if it's the left, but on the center of like the Namala mentions of both so-called are the ones that believe experts, right? The experts say this, experts say that, whatever. Now, this is in direct contradiction with the whole ethos of enlightenment. Are we people that believe other people, or are we people that don't believe other people? Oh, you should believe experts, and now we're religious again. Thank you very much. This is a basic problem. What?
Strong possibility. Strong possibility.
No, you should be religious again? Like, the Frimi that say do your own research, they're also a little weird. Like, do your own research for vaccines, but don't do it for Chumash Rashi. How does that work? Okay, but at least like maybe there's like a law of conservation, you know, like everyone believes one thing and this believes another thing. There's such theories. But anyways, but there's like a basic problem. And Mr. Harav Fatzadik Adamson wrote this book called something, Don't Believe Anyone, or Do Believe Anyone, I forgot what it's called, one of these things. And he's very funny because he's whatever. And I found it very interesting. But what he does is he frames this question in terms of the medieval question about taqlid, about believing on testimony. And since he's a shtickle expert on the Muslim religious philosophers, so he uses all of their justifications for saying why it's correct, it's even rational for most people to believe on faith. Faith not in some magical sense, in the sense of I'm not the smartest guy. I'm going to trust what the other people tell me, what the smarter people tell me, or what tradition tells me. And he says that this is actually rational. There's conditions for this. You read Sadigan and you read the other Muslims. They give conditions like when you should believe on testimony and things like that. But that's what you should do. And it's very funny coming from the atheist philosopher, suddenly giving arguments from Emunah Pshuta. But that's what the world runs on. It's true. How did I get into this?
By prefacing that it was not relevant to just say.
No, it's important. This is very important because you have this problem when you think that the people that were talking, the Rishonim, the people that talked about the Emunah Pshuta, talked about it in a very rationalist sense, in the sense of if I don't know, I will believe the people that do know. But they were very clear. He's also clear about this, by the way, in the book. They were very clear that this is not going to give you knowledge. You're not going to become a scientist by this. You're going to become what Aristotle calls something that's controlled by reason and not something reasonable, right? A slave of reason. You're not going to be reason itself. And even to be a slave of reason, you need to have potential for following laws or whatever, things that follow reason, but not things that are reason. And that is very nice. That's the best you can go for it. But you still, right, even after this whole justification, there still is an obligation, like in the Rishonim, in their language, like it's a mitzvah of Yediyas Hashem, to know things. And you don't solve, in other words, even if I could tell you that that's what I'm trying to get at. It being reasonable, entirely reasonable, contra what some other person would tell you, don't believe anything you don't check for yourself. It becomes actually reasonable for you to believe things on evidence, on testimony, because that's what the scientific consensus, whatever that is exactly, I don't have to know what it is. And it's not because potentially I could check it. Well, what does that even mean? You can't check it. You don't even know how to read English. How could you check it? But that would be very nice, that you could even call that certain knowledge. I could tell Descartes, well, Mr. Descartes, you're exaggerating with your demands because we can't live that way. And still his demand would be correct. In other words, you still wouldn't know things. Which is precisely why you should trust the people that do know. But that's the main thing. That doesn't solve this problem. And that's why in a certain sense, that problem is still a problem if you live in this expert world. Because at least for the value of knowledge, right? Not for the value of action. Action, you're going to do the best you could. Yeah, that's the nafkamina of that. Shine. Anyways. That is my thing, more or less.